Ambassador, thank you very much for talking to Diplomatic Connections. We very much appreciate this. I want to start with what I keep seeing, both on your on your tweets, not your tweets, but the embassy's tweets, and also in the press about Finland being voted the safest, most stable, and best governed country in the world. If this is the case, which I'm sure is true, why aren't we all packing our bags and rushing to Finland?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe it has something to do with the climate and the language.
I gather that the first snows have begun.
Yes, yes. And, well, but it's a successful country and we are very proud about it, especially when you remember the background. We were not always an affluent country, and for instance, 100 years ago when we had just gained our independence, we had a civil war, and so it's a big achievement where we are today.
But, for example, what is your crime rate?
It's relatively low. There are some areas which are of concern, as far as maybe not so much crime, but security. And one of those areas, for instance, is violence against women. We have not a very good record there, so it's one area of concern when we are talking about security in the society at large. The crime rate is not I mean, it's on the same level as in the other Nordic countries.
I mean, to pick another yardstick, perhaps, when did you last have a political crisis?
Well, it's totally dependent on how you
define a political crisis.
But we are a very stable country. Our government is always a coalition government. We have something like 10 parties represented in the parliament. So you always have to have a coalition, and that somehow tends to result in certain stability, because after the elections there are negotiations, how do you form the government, and then that tends to last for the whole period, which in our case is 4 years. We do have, of course, political crisis in the smaller sense, different ideas and perceptions about key issues, and sometimes, for instance, the government has difficulties in keeping its coalition intact, and that kind of crisis we do have. But it's we have. I think this fact that we are used to building coalitions is very important. The coalitions can change. We don't have, like many countries which have coalition governments, have sort of blocks. You have a rightist bloc, you have a center bloc, you have a leftist bloc. In Finland, you don't have this kind of blocks. You have parties sort of in different shades, and they can build coalitions in different combinations.
Just to go back to just stay on this political situation for the moment. In January, your president was re-elected for his second term.
Yes.
And also the coalition remained pretty much the same as it had been before.
Yes.
Which includes an extreme right party, the Finn party.
Well, the party that is in the government, I don't think it's an extreme right party. It's a populist party, but I wouldn't call it, if you compare to many other European parties, it's not really an extreme right party. And again, it was the coalition negotiations which were very important. So that's where you sort of trash out the political program for the government, and all the parties in the government are committed to that program. So that's where you sort of test whether you can sort of get the majority for a government, like in different coalitions. So, but since you brought up the question of the president and the government, our system is such that the president is elected through direct elections for 6 years term. He has certain competencies. He has certain competencies in foreign and security policy, especially. He's also the commander-in-chief of the defense forces. But the government is based on the parliamentary elections. So after the parliamentary elections, which will be coming in early next year, there are the negotiations about how to form the government, and that is then a 4 years term if the government sticks together.
Now, part of this positive approach to life in Finland is this program, this pilot program you have of giving what is it, something like $550 per head to the unemployed. It sort of arrives in their bank account if they have it. Is that project still a project, or has it become a universal policy?
It's an experiment, and it is now in the final stages, and it was a limited experiment to test how a universal basic income, which in this case is not universal because it's a limited group of people, how that kind of a system could simplify the sort of the social security safety network, and also incentivize people to move on in their lives. If they lose their job, to move on, and maybe also to find sort of self-employment, which may not give a living wage but could add to the wage. So it's an experiment, and it is in its final stages.
Experimental final stage to say yes or no, in other words?
No.
To expand it nationally, or to just drop it altogether?
I think what we expect to get is some understanding of how the existing social security network can be improved and made more of an incentive for people to move on. I think we also hope to get some understanding of what kind of, how do we adapt our societies to this so-called new economy, where actually jobs will be created but also lost at a pace which is accelerating.
Right.
And almost everybody will face a situation in their lives where they don't have a job that pays for their existence or for their family. So, of course, in our society, it's also important to understand that the so-called social security network is actually covering the whole population. And it means that everybody has health insurance, everybody has access to free education, and that kind of sort of basic security that everybody enjoys. And on top of that, of course, you then have the system that helps you in a situation where you don't have a permanent income on which you can actually live.
In other words, it's a birth to funeral welfare system.
Yes, it's welfare has a different notion here in the States in comparison to.
Well, I was thinking of it in terms of Britain,
security,
for example.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I would say that there is a basic security,
right?
Basic services, secure services, and basic security for everybody, irrespective of your income.
Well, how much does this differ from, say, the Swedish social program, or even, say, the Norwegian sort of? In other words, your neighbours.
Yes, all the Nordic countries have very similar overall approach, which means that the basic services like education, healthcare, and so on should be either free or very affordable for the whole of population. That's the basic approach. But then you, of course, have differences in how you implement that system and the details of the system. But the systems are very similar and the principle is very similar.
So Finland is a member of the European Union,
Yes,
but not a member of NATO.
yes.
And there is a sort of, as far as I can gather, a kind of an ongoing debate about whether or not Finland should join NATO. And sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. At the moment, of course, Finland is involved in a major NATO exercise.
Yes.
So although you're not in NATO, you work closely with the North Atlantic Alliance.
Yes.
How closely?
Well, we are one of the so-called enhanced opportunities partners of NATO, which means that we have a very close partnership with NATO. And there are 5 countries which have this kind of partnership, which also means that each of us have sort of tailored our partnership with NATO according to the needs of the partner and NATO. Sweden is also this kind of a partner with NATO. So the partnership is very close and very pragmatic. The aim of the partnership is to make sure that our defense forces are, well, I would say 100% interoperable with the NATO forces. And that's why we do a lot of joint exercises. We participate, but always as partners. Since we are not members of NATO, we have the role of partner also in the exercises. And there are many other levels of partnership. The bottom line is that we are not members, so we are not covered by the security guarantees of NATO, nor the obligation for mutual
No Article 5.
No Article 5, but
and no 2% contribution.
Yes, but we have taken defense very seriously throughout our history, so we have actually invested quite a lot in our national defense and are investing also in the future. We are actually reaching more than 2% in a few years because we are doing some important investments. In addition to the robust national defense, we have this sort of network of partnerships with NATO, with Sweden, with the other Nordic countries, and also we put a lot of emphasis on further developing the security and defense dimension of the European Union. Not as a challenge to NATO, but actually complementing and
How do you think, parenthetically to this, how do you think that the departure of the United Kingdom is going to affect the European Union's security ambitions? Wouldn't not?
It's a loss. It's a big loss, obviously, because the UK is an important foreign policy power, and it has very efficient and capable defense forces. So it's a loss. As you may know, the defense activities of the European Union are in concrete terms very much about crisis management. And of course, if the UK is not involved, we are losing a lot of influence and capabilities. But we hope very much that we can keep the UK as close as possible to the European Union, also in this regard, because I think together we, the European Union and UK, share in many interests as far as security is concerned, and it makes sense to cooperate and continue to be as close as possible.
I'm going off on a tangent here, but and we'll have to get back to the NATO business. But do you think that that Brexit has been or is going to be the corrosive factor that some people were afraid that it would be, or has it in fact been, if you like, a lesson to other members who might feel a little restive?
Well, the polls seem to show that it's the latter,
right.
That actually the support of the European Union has gone up in all the member states, and the importance that the member states and their populations attach to a more efficient European Union has actually grown. So we do think that Brexit is a very, very unfortunate thing, but it
But
seems
an aberration rather than a...
yes, and it seems to have focused the minds of the populations in the European Union on the fact that irrespective of whether we dislike some aspects of the European Union, without the European Union we would be weaker and less secure.
So if an EU referendum were held in your country tomorrow, what would be the result?
I think it would be something like strong support, 60-70%. At the moment there's basically no serious movement to exit the European Union. There's a lot of discussion about how could we make the European Union more efficient and sort of less focused on less important things, focused on more important things. And of course we also have some serious issues in the European Union. It's much more about, you know, understanding that it's a necessary thing, but then having a very lively debate of how to make it better, and what obviously also a lot of criticism as far as the, let's say, the defaults or the problems are concerned.
Get back to the NATO membership or non-membership, really. To what extent is this the result of an awareness, not necessarily, to the extent the result of Russian pressure?
I don't think at all. I don't think...
well, perhaps Russian pressure is the bad way of putting it. Of Russia's presence in and the history that Russia's presence has with your country.
Well, Russia is our neighbor. We have a long border with Russia, and obviously Russia is a difficult neighbor in many respects, and especially today. 10 years ago there was a better period, and so Russia is always a part of the calculation as far as Finland is concerned, as far as Sweden is concerned, also as far as the NATO countries themselves are concerned. But it works two ways. Russia is, for some people, a reason to be for NATO membership, and for some people it's a reason to say, well, maybe this is not a good time to consider joining NATO. But I would say the more fundamental reasons for the fact that there is no popular support for applying for membership in NATO are sort of elsewhere. They are more in the history and in this notion that we don't feel very sort of insecure in Finland. If you ask people, they are not very worried about military security or that kind of, you know, security issues. And on the other hand, many people feel that the existing policy that we have in place, robust national defense, all the partnerships, and a very sort of consistent foreign policy actually have put us in quite a good place as far as the military security aspects are concerned. However, I have to emphasize that Finland is not a neutral country. We don't belong to a military alliance, but we belong to a political alliance, and that is the European Union. Mm-hmm. So we absolutely feel that we are part of the same security community as the other EU countries, which are also NATO countries, most of them. So it's not as if being outside of NATO would somehow put us between East and West. We are in the West and we are part of that security community. We are part of that political union. So,
part of the security community, however, without the comfort of the treaty assurance
yes.
that North Atlantic Treaty Organization members enjoy, whether it is more a myth than a reality is another story. But there is no assurance that the rest of NATO will jump to your aid if the Belarusians decide to attack.
Yes, two issues. First of all, there's a Finnish sort of characteristic which is again rooted in our history, and that is that you always have to bear the responsibility for yourself, for your security, primarily yourself. That's the obligation of any independent nation. You cannot delegate your security anywhere. So in that sense, I think being outside of NATO or within NATO, the practical consequences would be the same. We want a robust national defense force and capability, and we want to be 100% interoperable with the defense forces of our friends. The second observation is that in the European Union, even if I just said that it's not a military alliance, there is a clause there in the basic treaty which forms an obligation to come to the assistance if one of us is attacked in one way or another. And when that clause was negotiated, we took it very seriously, understanding that the EU doesn't have the military muscle to do anything, but it's a strong political commitment. And it is exactly the same in NATO. The political commitment is the key. The difference between NATO and EU is that NATO has the military muscle and the different structures to actually operate. EU doesn't. But the political commitment is absolutely necessary in both of these cases. And through EU we have that political commitment. So these two aspects I think are important to understand.
How much traffic is there people to people between Finland and Russia?
Well, quite a lot. It has gone down.
Tourism, for example?
Yes, a lot of tourism. St. Petersburg, which is only about maybe 100 kilometers from the Finnish border, maybe a little bit more, has the same population as the whole of Finland. So there is a lot of interaction, a lot of Russian tourists to Finland. The political and military crisis as far as the Ukraine is concerned and the economic crisis in Russia have resulted in a drop, but it's sort of picking up again. And this kind of people-to-people contacts we think are important, and they are also an investment in the future, in the sense that we of course hope that Russia will develop into a more, I would say, normal country, European country, stable, democratic, with good governance, respect for human rights, and the people-to-people contacts are an element to hopefully get there one day.
When I was in Russia in the early 60s, Helsinki was where we came up for air.
Yes, I think it
and
is.
where we bought our most of our food.
Yes, I think that is still the case, and the region close to the border to Russia is also, they get a lot of tourists, and since you mentioned air, maybe in the back in those days it was more about political sort of freedom and air in that sense. And
no, it was all about fresh eggs and vegetables and you know.
And today it is very much also about fresh air, concrete, clean air,
yes,
breathing air. And,
right.
and the fact that our society functions well and you can trust the authorities and it's safe. So it's I think a big attraction for ordinary middle class Russians who want to enjoy those aspects of life.
Well, okay, but you say that the ordinary Finn it doesn't look over his shoulder with apprehension at Russia, but there is a size difference which is an enormous factor. But there's also the fact that you know, Finland has been through Finlandization once. You know, the Treaty of Finland in 1948, yes, 1948, was, you know, in effect, guaranteed what you might call neutrality for Finland from the Soviet Union, so that it didn't become one of the Baltics or an East European country. However, it was a very finely defined neutrality, which involved a strong consciousness of what the Russians might or might not want. Given the fact that you know, Mr. Putin is on an expansive mood, at least seems to be in that direction. If you look at the Ukraine, you look at Crimea. Isn't this a worry that the new Finlandization might actually come about? I don't mean that you'd be invaded, but that you have to increasingly be conscious of what the Russians are up to.
It's not a worry. It's not a worry, but what is a worry is that if the international system, not only as far as security is concerned, but very much also as far as trade is concerned, if the international rules-based system is eroded, that is a worry. That is a big worry, because in that kind of a situation, the bad forces, wherever they come from, have more possibilities. And countries like mine, small countries, very dependent on exports and open economy, we would suffer if the rules don't exist and if it is only brute power that dominates. But we are worried certainly about some activities of the Russians. I just wanted to sort of say that as far as military attack or anything like that is concerned, it's not something that we would lose our sleep over. We are, as a society, as a nation, quite confident about ourselves, also about our own internal strength, our resilience. So as far as that kind of pressure from the outside that you refer to, political pressure that we were certainly under during the Cold War, we feel that we are strong today. We are not in a similar situation, and we are as a society very strong. I think it is important to remember also why Finland ended up in the place we ended up after the Second World War.
Well, you know, because you were on the wrong side.
We were on the wrong side, and we were basically assigned to the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union by the Allies, Allied forces. So we didn't. It was not our choice. We made the best out of it, and today we are a strong, confident, resilient society, which is, however, dependent on a good rules-based international system. We are dependent on institutions like the European Union. For us, NATO is important, and even if we are not members, we are, through our own contributions, actually also contributing to the security of NATO. So yes, we are worried about many developments, including in Russia very much, but we are also sort of pragmatists, and you know, this is the situation. So we try to act in such a manner that we can diminish the insecurities and uncertainties and strengthen the things that bring security. And I'd like to mention just one thing, and that is we are all talking very much about the so-called hybrid threats,
Right.
disinformation,
Right.
and that kind of
Absolutely.
issues.
That was going to be my next question. Yeah.
Which are a real and existing issue and problem and danger. And as a nation, we have a very robust system to sort of guard against that kind of threats. But we also took the initiative to establish something called a Center of Excellence, European Center of Excellence against hybrid threats. So that is based in Helsinki, and there are something like almost 20 countries involved, including the US, and we are comparing notes and exchanging best practices on how to individually but also collectively improve our resilience against that kind of threats.
This is through social media, I mean attacks through social media and other...
Well, that's one dimension, but there are many other dimensions as well. Social media is often related to disinformation threats, but there are other hybrid threats as well, cyber threats and other measures through which you can try to hurt or harm or destabilize societies or economies.
Economy. Doesn't, is it Latvia or Lithuania that actually has the NATO cyber center?
Yes, Estonia has the Center of Excellence for Cyber. Latvia, I think, has the Center of Excellence for Strategic Communication.
I see.
And Lithuania has a Center of Excellence on energy issues.
But these are all
NATO
organizations.
And a Finnish, or it's not a Finnish, it's a European, has the beauty of combining both EU and NATO countries, and actually the two institutions cooperating together in that Center of Excellence.
What would be a nightmare scenario of that would really undermine this pragmatism that you have? I mean, an international, a nightmare scenario, presumably global nightmare.
Well, I think there are several nightmare scenarios, and it's good to not to be too much fixated on one, because normally the threat scenarios that we think about come from the past.
Okay.
And it's important to try and be sort of a little bit innovative, and think about different kinds of threat scenarios. And the bottom line, whatever threat scenario you are thinking, there are maybe three bottom lines. One is that it all comes back to what is the shape of your own society. What is the resilience, level of resilience, level of trust in your own society, how well governed is your own society, and so whatever the threat is, that is a key. So we are trying to focus on that. The other important aspect is the state of the institutions, international institutions, and again that's an area where we want to focus upon. And then other forms of international cooperation. So rather than dwell too much on the threat scenarios, we are trying to identify what are the important ingredients for countering any threat and avoiding and preventing those threat scenarios to actually take place. I think one of the critical issues is the so-called refugee or migration crisis that we witnessed in Europe in 2015 and 16, and that situation was a very specific and exceptional situation, but the silver lining was that we started to much more than previously focus on what do we have to do in order to prevent that kind of crisis happening again, and it's a tricky issue. I don't think there's any one single answer. You actually have to put in place quite a toolbox of many different activities, and you absolutely need international cooperation on many levels.
And part of it, of course, is an effort to make the source countries more livable for these people, so that they don't actually migrate in the first place. Was there much of a refugee problem in Finland?
Yes. In 2015, in about 4 months, we got tenfold the number of asylum applicants as we would normally get in a year. So we would normally get in a year something between 3,000 and 5,000 applications for asylum. And in the last 4 months of 2015, we got 33,000. If you take that proportionately to the US, you would speak about amounts like 1.6 million in 4 months. We got less than, for instance, Sweden, but,
right.
but most of the asylum seekers came through Sweden to Finland, and it was a very difficult situation. But now we are back to more or less the normal figures. So all the different actions that the European Union has put in place have worked to some extent.
Right.
But of course, it's not a guarantee as far as the future is concerned.
not.
And there we come to the question that you raised, the countries of origin, what is the situation there, economic development, social development. Then you come to the countries of transit, the smugglers, the external border, and so on.
Yes, it's a harrowing story.
Complicated.
Helsinki recently was the venue of the Putin-Trump summit, much discussed Putin-Trump summit. Was Finland asked to do this, or did you offer it?
Well, we like to think that everybody knows that we are always ready to offer our good services. So in that sense, we didn't need to specifically offer anything. I think that's a well-established fact that Finland has over the decades served as a convening place. And but we finally, of course, the concrete request came from the 2 countries, and we were happy to say yes, because we do think that dialogue is necessary, and we are ready to offer our good services as far as the venue is concerned. We were not responsible for the meeting itself or the results,
of course.
And I can tell you that it was not a simple thing to organize something like that in a couple of weeks in the middle of the summer, when every Finn is out in their summer cottages and on holidays. So.
But how much of the organization in the end fell to the Finnish government, and how much did the 2 participating countries sort of come in with their own, if you like, with their own operational teams?
Well, all the substance of the meeting was handled by the 2 parties. We were not involved in the substance at all.
But the logistical nightmare was yours.
The logistical nightmare was ours.
Right, I see. And how, looking at the United States, what effect, if any, has this had on your bilateral relations?
Well, what, the meeting?
Yes. The fact that the meeting took place, not its substance, I mean.
Right. Well,
the fact that you were kind enough to interrupt your summer holiday in order to put this together.
Well, normally the parties, like in this case also, I think appreciated the fact that somebody is ready to do it and offers that kind of services, and that is the case here too. As far as the bilateral relationship with the US is concerned, I think it has been excellent for many years, and depending on the administration here, we have areas of cooperation, and we also have areas where we don't see eye to eye. But the relationship as such is, I think, excellent.
Right, never mind the areas of cooperation. Where do you not see eye to eye?
Well, at the moment, the biggest issue is trade policy. Finland is a very open economy, small, very advanced economy, very dependent on a level playing field, rules-based international trading system, and the trade policy of the US is of concern. It has not had a direct impact on our bilateral trading relationships, or not a big impact, but it has already had an impact on the international trading system, and that is our biggest headache. If the rules-based international trading system starts to unravel, we are in big trouble, and we think everybody is in big trouble. So that's the biggest area of concern. There are others as well. One of the most important areas is the climate policies.
Mm-hmm.
In Finland, if you ask an ordinary man or woman in the street, what are you most worried about in the world? In the top three, everybody would say climate change. And there's a very high awareness of this issue and the need for international cooperation. And the fact that the US decided to withdraw from the Paris climate agreement is, in our opinion, very unfortunate. However, we are very much hoping and trying to encourage the US and also some actors in the US to stay involved and continue to pursue, if not the agreement, implementation of the agreement, at least some areas where there are positive consequences as far as climate is concerned. One of the areas where we have been working well together with the US and actually also with Russia is the Arctic.
I was going to ask you about the Arctic
Yes.
Council, of which your president is currently the chairman, is he not?
Yes, Finland is chairing the
Oh,
Arctic
Finland has the
Council.
presidency there.
Yes.
Is that what it is? Yeah.
And we took it over from the US
Mhm.
in May last year, and the cooperation has been good, and that is quite important. It's important because obviously the political situation vis-à-vis Russia is not
Sure.
good. The Arctic Council is formed by the 8 Arctic countries,
Right.
5 Nordic countries, Russia, Canada and US. And the cooperation has continued, and that is a very positive fact.
What, when you say the cooperation has continued, what initiatives have come out of this that one can talk about?
Yeah. Well, there are 3 international agreements, very concrete agreements, which are important and have come out of the, let's say, the large, broad umbrella of the Arctic Council cooperation. One is related to the search and rescue, which is hugely important.
Good.
Nobody can manage that alone in the Arctic. One is related to preventing and handling possible oil spills. Again, a critically important issue which nobody
Handling what?
oil spills.
Oh, yes.
Accidents in that sense, environmental accidents. And the third is related to scientific cooperation. The work in the Arctic Council is very much about building a sort of a common baseline understanding and looking at some critical areas where we need cooperation. Just to mention one example. One of the focuses of the Finnish presidency or chairmanship has been meteorological cooperation.
Oh, right.
We have too little concrete information about what is happening in the Arctic, and we need more.
What is going to happen?
Yes. So that kind of issues.
Mm-hmm. And where does the Arctic Council have a headquarters?
Well, that's the beauty of the organization. No headquarters, a small secretariat in Norway.
I see.
But it's the participating governments and also the participating regions, which are the regions that we have in the Arctic.
Right.
Yeah.
Coming down to something more personal about your own diplomat experiences, career experience. You've been here before, of course.
Yes.
You were here in the year 2000. You were here
97 to 2000. Yeah.
as,
Political officer. Yeah.
and so you find the different Washington, I presume.
Yes.
It differs in many, such as.
Well,
I'm not talking about bureaucratic Washington. I'm more or less talking about Washington to live in at the moment.
I think Washington. I loved Washington back in those days, and I love Washington today. It's a wonderful city, wonderful combination of a sort of a feeling of a small town and a very international city at the same time. And I think the city has improved a lot, and there is maybe more variety as far as, let's say, culture or restaurants and things like that are concerned. But it has still retained its very green character and welcoming character. So yes, change is mostly for the better, I would say, but also still the same
Yes.
sort of atmosphere.
And in terms of working in it?
Very similar in the sense that this is one of the great cities where you have easy access to be it administration officials, Congress, business, civil society, think tanks. You have the best experts in almost any field that you can imagine, and the access is easy. Obviously, the polarization that has increased has to some extent had an impact on the, let's say, the atmospherics, but I find it still very easy to get to talk with almost anybody, and there's this wonderful give and take interest which is unique, I think.
So, what would you say? What would you tell a newly arriving female ambassador by way of advice?
I think my advice would be the same for be it female or male ambassador, and that is that it's always important to find, your own group of reference where you feel at ease and you get support and you get good ideas. It's important to build the networks. It's important also to reach out to, let's say, audiences and networks that you are not necessarily so comfortable in or wouldn't be so natural for you. Today, I think even more than, for instance, 20 years ago, it's important to talk with different kinds of people in the administration, outside of the administration, outside of Washington, D.C., go out, visit the different states and the different business communities and so on. I think that would be my advice. We are something like about 20 women ambassadors in Washington,
27
D.C.
actually.
Sorry?
27.
Okay, it's gone
At
up
the
very
moment,
quickly
yeah.
because it was less than 20.
Yes, it was for a while, but it has been more.
It has been more, yes. So it's still a relatively small group. We know each other quite well, and it's always a very welcoming group. But for instance, for me, another group that was very important when I came here and is still extremely important are the Nordic ambassadors,
Sure.
and thirdly the EU ambassadors. So,
Yes.
so I think for anybody who comes to a new city, it's important to have your own sort of home bases and then broaden from there.
But it's a fact that the diplomatic community in Washington, as elsewhere, groups itself either by geography or by international agreement or so on.
Yeah.
In other words, the EU. I mean, you have what, breakfast with the
Yeah.
together once a month at least, and your DCMs have lunch once a month at least.
Yeah.
So you're all in touch, and presumably part of that is compare notes, but the other part is to try and fashion a unified approach.
Yes, the European Union is, since it is an organization, it's a union where we are deeply integrated, and there are actually policy areas where the union has the competence, like trade policy. Individual countries don't have their own trade policy. We have a union trade policy. So that the cooperation here in Washington, D.C. between the EU countries is very tight. It's about comparing notes, it's about lines to take, and so on. And it reaches each and every field that we cover. It is true that the geographic sort of groups tend to have their
African,
own.
for example,
Yes.
Asian,
Yes.
a British Commonwealth.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think there are also wonderful venues here where it's possible to mingle. Here in Washington, D.C., and I would also like to mention the State Department organizes trips
Yes.
outside of Washington, and these are great opportunities to actually get to know your colleagues from different continents and places. But I would also like to mention, for instance, Meridian International.
Yes, you're the one foreign ambassador on the new diplomatic initiative which
Yes.
they have launched.
There's the Executive Council of Diplomacy. There are many
Right.
other venues where you meet, and this is extremely important. There are also wonderful venues for outreach, which
Right.
I think is extremely important for embassies to have a connection with your environment that is on top of the, let's say, the everyday work and
Provides continuity.
continuity, and an important sort of, you have to be a little bit grounded on your environment
Right.
beyond politics or beyond trade, and this outreach and communication and contact with the community in broader terms is very important.
One final question. You didn't think we'd get there, did you? How big is the Finnish diaspora?
It's we usually say that we have something like 700,000 Americans with Finnish ancestry. So it's not huge in comparison to, for instance, Sweden or Norway, but it's relatively scattered. It's mostly sort of third generation, even fourth, but there are also more recent comers. So it's an important diaspora, but maybe not as sort of they are. I mean, it's part of the American society, so it's
Right.
they have their own organizations. We cooperate with them, but it's so it's an important thing, but not the dominating sort of aspect of the work of the embassy, especially since we have 2 consulates general, which sort of
Yes.
in New York and in Los Angeles, and they are more present maybe with these and have more contact with the communities that are.
Assuming you do have spare time, what do you do with it?
I read a lot, and I do bicycle riding, and also travel a little bit, and of course.
And are you nearing the end of your term?
I think I will be here for almost 2 more years. So.
That's a long term.
Well, 5 years. I think that's an optimal term.
Yes.
I think 4 years is a little bit short, because this is a very demanding environment. You have to be, building the networks takes some time, and you should be also out in the outside of the beltway. So it takes a while to build those connections, and actually to start to
get
to produce
get
something.
some, yes.
Yeah.
To
So
get some.
I think 5 years is a good time, and I'm very glad if I can stay 5 years here.
Thank you very much indeed for this.
Thank you.
Very
Thank
much.
you.